Hello again. I have a lot written in front of me now. I've kept up our model of the monopolist and the deadweight loss associated with the monopolist over here. And I've added another version of our monopolist, the model of a monopolistic firm here. This one, this is what we would expect the monopolist to be facing in terms of revenue and cost curves if this is a natural monopoly which can lower cost per unit by lower cost per units by increasing scale, and that's the source of its monopoly power. I put this up here because, well, it's in the textbook, and it tends to be what we want to look at when we think about how we might regulate a monopoly because of that problem right there of the inefficiency of monopoly. Economists and most people in general are not really out to do something in or change something just because they're making an economic profit. That's not really the problem. The problem is that inefficiency there. So the way to address it and think about it is to look at this model because this is kind of like sort of like the most problematic one to look at and thus the most thought-provoking, I suppose we could say. That's what we're at to do. Now up here I have the model in equilibrium for the perfect competitor. And I'm going to circle back around that hopefully at the end of this little discussion in this video. So since this is the problem, we have to say, if we're policymakers, what do we want to do about the problem? Now, it's a clear thing to me that in this model, if I want to do away with the deadweight loss and I'm going to regulate the monopoly to do that, one thing I could do to the monopolist is say, you must charge a price where marginal cost equals demand. Now, if they charge this price where marginal cost equals demand, then to get that price, the quantity would rise out to here, and this becomes the market price. And it's not about consumer advocacy, the lower price here. It's about doing away with this triangle. If we did that, this triangle goes away, and we are no longer producing a lesser quantity because it's maximizing profit, then people are actually willing and able to purchase along the marginal cost curve, which the monopolist is actually willing and able to produce because people are still willing and able to purchase it at a price above paying that marginal cost. That's an aspect I stuttered on and hesitated on because I want to come back to that and I want to explain that more using this. So in this model, that's pretty straightforward and simple. Marginal cost pricing is what that's called. It's a form of regulation on the monopoly. And that would work well if the monopolist was like a resource monopoly. But if it's a natural monopoly, like over here, we have a problem with that. Because if we do the same thing, if we price at marginal cost, where marginal cost equals demand, we are below, for that quantity, we are below the cost per unit. Before I draw on this some more, let me explain what's going on a little bit more over here. This is a producer who increasing output lowers cost per unit. And the reason that marginal cost is below this downward sloping average total cost is just like it is over here along this segment. It just hasn't intersected it yet. If these lines went off into space, eventually average total cost would start to rise and marginal cost would cross it at its minimum. But that's out here, way outside of where demand is, so it's not an irrelevant area of the curve we're looking at. They are still in a place where they have economies of scale, and demand is in that range of their cost curves, and that's why they're a natural monopoly, is because they still are enjoying economies of scale as a sole producer. So that's what's going on with this picture. Now, going back to the regulation idea that we explained over here works no problem, but here presents some problems. If we regulate the monopoly and tell them to produce here so that they price at, I recognize that just says P star. That might be off the recording screen. That's just P star. If we do that, the challenge is that that's below their price per unit they're receiving is below their cost per unit. That's what average total cost is. So this is then a loss. And now this is a problem because the government is requiring this to happen if we're regulating the monopolists to make that happen. So a solution in order to get the good actually produced would be for the government to step in and subsidize the monopolist to compensate them for the loss so that the output happens. That's probably not politically favorable in the United States. We don't do that here. They do tend to do that in Europe, as I understand it, but we don't use marginal cost pricing to address the inefficiency of monopoly in the U.S. What we try to do is average total cost or average cost pricing in the U.S. So instead of trying to get output clear out to here, we settle for something, and it is a settle, like here, where now what we're doing is requiring the monopolist to produce and price where average total cost is equal to the price. And what that means is, like the perfect competitor up here, zero economic profit for the monopolist. Now, there's some challenges with either method, the European method, which is still in orange, or the American method, which is here in green. One challenge with that is, if you're told that you're only going to be able to charge according to your costs, a price according to your costs, what good does it do you to lower your costs? The government's just going to tell you, then you have to lower your price. So it disincentivizes innovation or doing things to lower your costs. So that's a bit of a problem with either of the pricing strategies, marginal cost or average cost pricing strategies. Just something that's there. Other alternatives to address the problem of monopoly include trying to break up the monopoly. But again, if it's a monopoly that's enjoying economies of scale, breaking up the monopoly may reduce those benefits of scale and just raise costs by that across many firms instead of having one. If they lose scale, they may have higher average total costs, and so what you've effectively done is found a way to reduce the problem of deadweight loss by raising costs. So that has its drawbacks. Another policy alternative to any time in public policy, a policy alternative is always to do nothing. And the arguments for doing nothing are that these pure monopolies in our economy are actually few and far between. And the examples that I know of, like I said, Walmart and things like this that have come up, they tend to be short-lived. And it could be that as they say, the medicine is worse than the sickness if we do try to do things about them. Another solution is to have the government take over the production of the good or the service. And it could be that we have things in our economy that really are this already, like the United States Postal Service, right? Things like this we can do. The challenge is with that, and there's a challenge, we're a study of trade-offs, so that's why I'm putting out a challenge for each remedy. The status quo is the solution to the challenge that we see here, right? Status quo was going back to doing nothing. So the idea of taking something over by the government actually is not politically favorable, probably in the U.S., just in a political sense. But the challenge with that is also that once it's taken over by the government, there's no longer the profit motive, and so managers who aren't seeking to be innovative or to lower costs are likely to stay in place, and the consumers of the good or service have very little recourse except to try to change things politically. And that's sometimes harder to do than it is to simply not buy from a monopolist or to go to some near substitute, even if the good doesn't have a perfect substitute. So those are the alternatives available to us to address the problem of the inefficiency of monopoly. I put this up here because I have found in discussing these things, all of these things, having explored the monopolist is an easier time to circle back and to explain something about the perfect competitor and the monopolist. The perfect competitor is a desirable situation, or competitive markets are desirable because they are efficient. Because here, when this firm is in equilibrium, they are producing at the lowest cost possible, the lowest cost per unit possible. They're at the minimum of average total cost. And here, this firm is producing, back in the original, before I changed the Q, this firm is producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, as they all do, right? But not at the minimum of average total cost. That's way down here. They're producing something above the minimum of average total cost, right? So average total cost is not at its minimum, I should say. So we're not getting the most out of our resources as a society unless we're producing at the minimum of average total cost, or the minimum cost per unit. So that's one aspect that makes perfect competition preferred by economists to monopoly, is this idea of getting the most of our resources or producing at the lowest possible cost. I wanted to have this model up here to point out something else. If demand rises, or the price that the perfect competitor can get, that's a lift up here like this, and the quantity will rise, right? Because each firm, all firms will produce where marginal revenue is marginal cost if they're profit maximizing. So I could say that all along here, depending on the price, the perfect competitor will produce. So at various prices, these quantities, going down here to this axis, those various quantities are what that perfect competitor will produce. Even if the price falls, you might remember back from that chapter, the perfect competitor will still produce all the way down to average variable cost. So what I'm saying is the marginal cost curve that I'm darkening now, everywhere above average variable costs represents the various quantities that the seller would be willing and able to produce at various quantities, at various prices. That is the various quantities that the seller would be willing or able to produce at various prices. Does that sound familiar? Oops, I revealed it by writing the wrong thing. The various quantities that sellers are willing and able to produce at various prices is a supply curve. So if you add up how much these quantities are from this firm to the next firm, to the next firm, to the next firm at these prices, you would arrive at the market supply curve. So we can get our market supply curve from this individual supply curves of these firms, which are the marginal cost curve above their average variable costs. That is actually also true for the monopolist. But I wanted to do this at this time, I think, because it seems to me to make sense to compare the efficiency of the perfect competitor relative to the monopolist at this time. And I think it ties in well with this idea of regulations stepping in to tell the monopolist what quantities to produce. At least I hope it makes sense there. So that's what I have to say about the idea of regulating monopolies and tying it back and comparing it more to our perfect competitor. I hope you liked it a little bit.